My wife publicly mocked my salary. Then her CFO froze the room with one sentence, and this is my real-life story as lesson to others. So my name Jack Holland and I am 56 years old. And before you judge me, before you decide you already know the kind of man I am, let me tell you something straight up. I never imagined my life would boil down to one night, one sentence, one laugh that cut deeper than any punch ever could. Because for most of my life, I was invisible in a way that feels harmless until it isn't. The kind of invisible where people smile at you, or don't really see you, where they shake your hand but forget your name 5 seconds later, where you stand beside someone successful and slowly start to feel like background noise in your own marriage. And I didn't start out that way, not at all. I started out hopeful, proud, steady. The kind of bloke who believed that showing up every day and doing the right thing mattered more than titles or applause. But that belief gets tested when the world around you starts clapping for someone else and looking at you like you're just taking up space. And the night my wife laughed at me was the night all of that came crashing down at once. It was a corporate event, the kind with polished floors, low lights, expensive drinks that all taste the same, forced laughter floating around like smoke. And people dress sharp enough to make you feel underdressed no matter what you wear. I remember adjusting my jacket, the same navy blazer I'd worn for years, the one my wife said made me look old-fashioned, and thinking how ridiculous it was that at my age I still cared what she thought about how I looked. But old habits die hard, don't they? Especially when you've spent decades trying to be supportive, trying to stay out of the spotlight so someone else can shine. And Linda was shining that night. She always did at these things. She moved through the room like she owned it, confident, loud, magnetic. People leaned in when she spoke. Executives laughed a little too hard at her jokes. And I stood there beside her holding a drink I barely touched, nodding when spoken to, answering politely when asked what I did, watching her eyes flick away whenever the attention shifted toward me, and that should have been my first warning. But I'd ignored a lot of warnings over the years, because it's easier to tell yourself everything's fine than to admit you might be slowly losing your place in someone's life. And when the question came, the one that set everything off, it seemed innocent enough. Someone asked how she balanced such a demanding role with family life. And she laughed, that sharp, confident laugh that used to make me smile, and that night made my stomach tighten. And she turned toward me with her glass raised slightly, not in a toast, more like a prop, and said it helps when your husband's job is more of a hobby than a career. And for half a second, I thought I misheard her, like my brain was trying to protect me by refusing to process the words. But then the laughter came, not thunderous, not cruel on purpose. Just enough to let me know the joke had landed, just enough to make my face heat up and my chest feel hollow. Before I could even catch my breath, she added that I made in a year what some people in the room made in a month. Bless his heart, she said. Bless his heart, like I was a well-meaning child. And that was the moment I realized something inside me had finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, clean break. Because I had spent my life believing respect came from effort and loyalty. And there I was being reduced to a punchline, either one person who was supposed to have my back. And I wanted to disappear, I wanted to melt into the carpet, I wanted the night to end, but it didn't, because right then, just as the laughter started to fade, and the room began to move on like nothing had happened, a man I barely knew cleared his throat. And that sound, that simple sound, cut through everything. It was the CFO, Mark Reynolds, a man I'd spoken to maybe twice. A man who had never once asked me about my life outside of work. And he didn't raise his voice or make a show of it. He just set his glass down and said, "Actually, that's not accurate." And the room quieted in that strange, uncomfortable way rooms do when they sense something real is about to happen. And he looked straight at my wife and said that my work had saved the company millions. That without my compliance framework, the entire organization would have been exposed to penalties that could have shut it down. And he suggested we show some respect. And I swear to you, it felt like time slowed, like every eye in that room flicked from him to me and then to her. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the smallest person standing there. My wife's face drained of color, her smile froze halfway, and she looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. And in that silence, that heavy, shocked silence, I felt something strange, not triumph, not happiness, but clarity, the kind that hits you when you finally understand a truth you've been avoiding. The truth that my value had never been the problem was that I'd allowed someone else to define it for me. And as the room slowly came back to life and people awkwardly shifted and pretended they hadn't just witnessed something deeply uncomfortable, I realized that sentence hadn't just frozen the room, It had cracked my marriage wide open. It had exposed years of quiet disrespect, of being talked over, dismissed, minimized. And as I stood there at 56 years old, surrounded by people who suddenly looked at me differently, I knew my life was about to change in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Because when you push a man to the edge long enough, when you mock him, belittle him, and assume he'll always stay silent, you forget one important thing: silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's patience, sometimes it's survival, and sometimes, mate, it's the calm before a reckoning that no one sees coming. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how one laugh turned into the moment I finally stood up, not with shouting or fists or drama, but with truth, timing, and a quiet kind of revenge that changed everything. I've always been a quiet guy, not the kind of quiet that comes from fear or weakness, but the kind that comes from knowing who you are and not needing to announce it to the world. The kind of man who believes that showing up on time, keeping your word, and doing your work properly still counts for something, even if nobody claps for it anymore. And for most of my life that belief carried me just fine. I built my career in logistics and compliance, work that sits behind the scenes. Work that most people don't understand and don't bother asking about because it doesn't come with fancy titles or dramatic stories. But it mattered. It kept companies running, kept them out of trouble, kept people employed. And it paid our bills, put food on the table, kept a roof over our heads, and gave me a sense of dignity that I was raised to value. And when Linda and I first met more than 30 years ago, that dignity was enough for both of us. We were young, broke, hopeful, dreaming in small apartments with second-hand furniture, talking late into the night about what our lives might look like someday. And back then we really were a team. We made decisions together, we struggled together, we celebrated small wins together. And when Linda started climbing the corporate ladder faster than either of us expected, I was genuinely proud of her, not threatened, not jealous, proud, because I knew how hard she worked and how sharp her mind was. I bragged about her to friends, offended her when people said she was too ambitious, and supported her through long hours and missed dinners without complaint, because that's what partners do, or at least what I thought they did. But somewhere along the way, quietly and slowly, something shifted. Her success stopped being something we shared and started becoming something she owned alone. And I didn't notice it at first, because changes like that don't announce themselves. They slip in through jokes, through tone, through small moments you tell yourself don't matter. Like when she started correcting me in public, finishing my sentences as if I might say the wrong thing, or when she'd laugh and tell people I lived in a boring little world while she lived in the real one, the big one. And I brushed it off every time, told myself she was just stressed, that big jobs come with pressure, that I was being too sensitive. Because admitting the alternative meant admitting that the woman I loved might not respect me anymore, and at 56 years old, that's a hard thing to face. Because it forces you to question decades of your life, decades of choices, decades of loyalty, and the truth is I didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe that love and history counted for more than titles and money, so I stayed quiet. I always stayed quiet. And the night of that event was just another example of how comfortable I'd become in that silence. I put on my old navy blazer, the one Linda hated, the one she said made me look like someone's uncle at a funeral. And I wore it anyway because it was clean, it fit, and it felt like me. And as we walked into that room full of polished smiles and sharp suits, I could already feel the familiar sense of shrinking, like I needed to take up less space to belong there. I stood beside her while she worked the room like it was her stage, laughing loudly, touching arms, commanding attention without effort, executives leaning in when she spoke, eyes lighting up like she was saying something important even when she wasn't. And I stood there holding a drink I barely touched, nodding politely, smiling when required, feeling more like an accessory than a husband. And every time someone asked what I did for a living, before I could answer, Linda jumped in. Logistics and compliance, she'd say with a little roll of her eyes, as if she was saying janitor or paperwork guy, and people would nod politely and move on. And each time it happened I felt a little smaller, a little more invisible. But I stayed quiet because that's what I'd trained myself to do over the years. I told myself it didn't matter what strangers thought, that I knew my worth, that I didn't need validation. But deep down something was rotting, because silence can protect you. But it can also hide problems until they grow into something ugly. And what I didn't realize then was that by staying quiet for so long, I never pushing back, I never demanding respect, I'd given permission for that contempt to grow unchecked, not just in her, but in the way others saw me too. And standing there that night, watching my wife shine while I faded into the background, I had no idea that this pattern of being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked was about to collide head-on with a truth that would change everything, because the man everyone ignored, the man everyone thought was harmless and insignificant, had been carrying far more weight than anyone realized, and the moment that weight was finally acknowledged, the balance of my entire life began to shift. That moment is burned into me so clearly that I can still feel it in my chest when I think about it, like my body remembers before my mind even catches up, because it didn't happen fast the way accidents do. It happened slow, stretched out, just long enough for the pain to really sink in. Someone raised a glass and asked Linda how she managed such a demanding role while keeping a family together, and it was meant to be a compliment. I could tell by the way they smiled at her. The kind of question successful people get asked all the time, and she laughed, not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one, but a loud, confident laugh that filled the space and pulled everyone's attention toward her like she was standing under a spotlight. And then she turned toward me, and in that split second, I thought she might say something kind, something about teamwork, about support, about how we built a life together. But instead she tilted her head slightly and said it helps when your husband's job is more of a hobby than a career. And the words hit me like a slap I wasn't prepared for. The room reacted before I could. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not roaring, not cruel in an obvious way, but enough to let me know the joke had landed, enough to let me know people were comfortable laughing at me. And before I could even process that, before I could swallow or breathe or blink properly, she kept going. Because she always did when she felt safe, and she added that I made in a year what some people in the room made in a month. Bless his heart, she said. Bless his heart, like I was some well-meaning fool who didn't know any better, and that sentence sliced me open in a way I didn't know words could. My chest tightened so hard I thought for a second I might actually be having a medical episode. My ears rang like I'd been standing too close to something loud. And all I could think was that 56 years of work, of early mornings and late nights, of responsibility and consistency, and doing the right thing even when no one was watching, had just been reduced to a punchline in under 10 seconds. And I wanted to speak. God, I wanted to speak. I wanted to defend myself, to say something sharp or funny or even angry, but my mouth wouldn't move. It was like my body had shut down to protect me, and instead I stood there frozen. Aware of every eye in the room, some looking at me with pity, some with judgment, some with amusement, and that mix was worse than outright cruelty, because it told me they didn't see me as a threat or an equal, just as something to react to. And Linda smiled, actually smiled, like she'd just delivered a perfect line. Like this was a moment she'd enjoy remembering later, and that smile hurt more than the laughter ever could, because it told me this wasn't an accident, this wasn't a slip. This was how she really saw me. And that's when I noticed the CFO, Mark Reynolds, a man I barely knew beyond polite greetings and brief meetings, a man who had never shared a meal with me or asked about my life, late 40s maybe, calm posture, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and he hadn't laughed, not even a polite smile. His face stayed neutral, almost tense, and while everyone else was still riding the echo of the joke, he slowly set his glass down on the table beside him. And the sound it made was soft, but somehow loud enough to cut through the noise, and then he cleared his throat, and that sound alone made the room start to settle, like people sensed something was off, and he said, "Actually, Linda, that's not entirely accurate," and his voice wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried, the way a voice does when it's used to being listened to, and conversations around us began to trail off, laughter died mid-breath. And the room grew quiet in that uncomfortable way where no one knows where to look, and he looked straight at her, not at me, not at the crowd, but at her, and he said that my work had saved the company over $12 million in the last year alone. That without the compliance framework I'd built and maintained, the company would be facing federal penalties that could have shut it down completely. And then he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said, "I suggest we show some respect," and the silence that followed was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, no laughs, no whispers, no clinking glasses, just shock hanging in the air. And I watched Linda's face change in real time, the color draining from her skin, her confident expression collapsing into something tight and uncertain. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, anything, but no sound came out, and for the first time in years she looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable, just exposed, and inside me something shifted, not pride, not relief, not even satisfaction, but awareness, cold and clear. Because if a man who barely knew me understood my value, if he could stand up in a room full of executives and speak it without hesitation, then the problem had never been my worth. The problem was that the person who was supposed to know me best had chosen not to see it. And as the room slowly came back to life, and people awkwardly pretended nothing monumental had just happened, I stood there realizing that the joke hadn't just embarrassed me, it had shattered the illusion I'd been living under for years. And the question that started echoing in my head wouldn't leave me alone. If my own wife didn't respect me, didn't value what I brought to the table, then what else had I been blind to in my own life? And standing there in that moment, with my heart still pounding and my hands finally starting to steady, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my place in the world, about who I was allowed to be, had just changed forever. And there was no going back to being the quiet man who let himself be laughed at, not anymore. After that night, nothing felt the same, not the house, not the silence between us, not even the way the air seemed to sit heavier in the car as we drove home. Linda stared straight ahead the entire time, her jaw tight, fingers gripping the steering wheel like she was holding herself together by force. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to ask if I was okay or to acknowledge what she had done. It was to say that Mark had overstepped, that he had embarrassed her in front of people who mattered. And the way she said it made my stomach sink, because there was no trace of guilt in her voice, only irritation. And that told me more than any apology ever could, because not once did she ask how I felt, not once did she look at me and say she was sorry. And in that moment, I realized the hurt I felt at the event wasn't going to fade. It was going to follow me home and sit between us like a third person we both refused to acknowledge. And over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd either ignored or explained away for years. Not because I suddenly became paranoid, but because once a blindfold comes off, you can't pretend you don't see what's in front of you. Linda stayed later at work more often, her phone never far from her hand, conversations lowered to whispers when I entered the room. Passwords changed on devices we used to share without a second thought, and I told myself it was work stress. That her job demanded secrecy, that I was reading too much into it. But the truth has a way of leaking through cracks no matter how hard you try to seal them. And one night, purely by accident, at least that's how it started, I saw something I wasn't meant to see. Her laptop was open on the kitchen counter. A separate email account logged in, one I didn't recognize, and I wasn't snooping then, I swear I wasn't. I just noticed it the way you notice something out of place in your own home. And that was enough to make my chest tighten, because in a marriage, secrets change the shape of things, and once I knew that account existed, I couldn't unknow it. So I started paying attention more closely. Not hacking, not spying, just watching patterns, and patterns don't lie. They repeat themselves. And one night curiosity finally got the better of me, not out of jealousy, not out of anger, but out of a need to understand the distance that had grown between us. And what I found wasn't graphic or dramatic in the way movies make it look. It was worse because it was subtle, emails between Linda and a board member, professional on the surface, but threaded with familiarity that went beyond work. Jokes that didn't need to be written, comments that assumed intimacy, plans for trips and dinners that conveniently didn't include me. And then there were the lines that cut the deepest, the ones where she described me as comfortable and predictable, safe. That word sat there on the screen like an insult wrapped in politeness. Safe, like I was a couch you sit on after a long day, useful but taken for granted, something you don't think about until it's gone. And reading that felt like having the last illusion ripped away, because it made everything make sense, the jokes, the eye rolls, the public corrections, the way she spoke about my work like it was beneath her. It wasn't just about money, it was about how she saw me. And she hadn't just started seeing me that way recently, she'd been carrying that view for years, maybe longer than I wanted to admit. And in that moment, something brutal settled in my chest, the realization that the woman I thought I knew had been quietly rewriting our marriage in her own mind while I was still living in the old version. And yet even then I didn't confront her. I didn't slam the laptop shut or demand explanations, because that's not who I am. I'm not the kind of man who explodes and burns everything down in one emotional moment. I'm the kind who absorbs, who processes, who sits with the truth no matter how uncomfortable it is. And while she went on believing I was clueless, that I'd always be the quiet husband in the background, I started preparing, not in a dramatic way, but in the only way I knew how, quietly and carefully, because when you've been underestimated your entire life, When people assume you're harmless because you don't shout or boast, you learn one powerful lesson that stays with you forever. People never see you coming, and sometimes that's the only advantage you need. Revenge, at least the kind that lasts and actually means something, doesn't always come with shouting matches or dramatic exits or slammed doors. And I learned that as I settled into a strange new rhythm after the truth revealed itself. Because instead of anger burning hot and fast, what I felt was something steadier, colder, almost calm. The kind of focus that comes when you finally understand the game you've been playing without knowing the rules. And I didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy anyone. That was never my goal. What I decided was that I would stop being careless with my own value. So I did what I had always done best. I worked quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention. I went back through contracts I'd reviewed years earlier, reread clauses most people skimmed past, rechecked compliance structures that everyone assumed were fine because they always had been. And as I did, patterns began to emerge, not crimes. Nothing flashy or illegal, but risks, small oversights layered on top of each other. Assumptions made by people who were used to moving fast and believed someone else was watching the details. And that someone had been me for years. I'd been smoothing edges, closing gaps, fixing problems before they became visible, not because I was told to, but because that's how I worked. And now I realized just how much depended on my silence and consistency. I documented everything carefully, dates, versions, changes, approvals, not to weaponize them, but to make the truth impossible to dismiss. Because truth backed by facts is a powerful thing. And as I worked, I became acutely aware of who benefited from the way things were, who relied on the systems I'd built but rarely acknowledged. And yes, Linda thought I was just doing my job, that I was the same predictable man she'd grown comfortable underestimating. And there was something almost painful about how easy it was for her to believe that. How little she suspected that every quiet hour I spent reviewing documents was also an hour spent reclaiming myself. I wasn't plotting some dramatic takedown. I wasn't fantasizing about public humiliation. What I was building was leverage, not to destroy, but to reveal. Because there's a difference between revenge and reckoning, and I wanted the latter. I wanted the truth laid out so clearly that no one could twist it or laugh it away. I wanted the value of my work to stand on its own, without my voice needing to rise above a whisper. And in those weeks, as I sat at my desk late into the evening with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, I understood something I'd never fully grasped before. Justice doesn't need blood or screaming or grand gestures. It doesn't need villains tied to train tracks or heroes making speeches. Justice needs patience, accuracy, and timing. It needs someone willing to hold the line until the right moment. And the longer I worked, the clearer it became that when that moment came, when the truth was finally spoken without anger or apology, it would land harder than any joke ever could. Because laughter fades, but facts have a way of changing everything they touch. The night I finally confronted Linda didn't look anything like the scenes you see in movies. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no raised voices echoing through the house, and in a strange way that made it heavier. Because calm can be terrifying when you're used to chaos hiding the truth. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, the television on but muted, that soft glow filling the space like it always had. And for a moment everything looked normal, almost peaceful. Which felt ironic considering what I was about to say. I told her we needed to talk, and she sighed like I was inconveniencing her, already half annoyed before I'd even opened my mouth. And I remember noticing how relaxed she looked, how confident she seemed in that moment, like she had no reason in the world to worry. And that told me she truly believed I was still the same man who would swallow whatever was handed to him. So when I told her I knew about the emails, about the board member, about the way she spoke about me when she thought I wasn't listening, she actually laughed, a short dismissive laugh, the kind that says you've misunderstood something and it's almost cute. And she told me I was being dramatic, that I was reading too much into things, that I didn't understand how her world worked. And normally, years ago, that might have stopped me, that tone, that certainty, but this time I didn't react at all. I just sat there and looked at her. And something in my face must have changed, because her laughter faded mid-breath. She studied me more closely, like she was suddenly seeing a stranger sitting across from her, and I could tell she realized I wasn't bluffing, that this wasn't an emotional outburst or a moment of insecurity that would pass. I told her calmly that it wasn't just the emails. It was the jokes, the disrespect, the way she'd spoken about my work like it was a punchline. The way she'd turned me into something small to make herself feel bigger, and the more I spoke, the quieter she became, not because she felt guilty, but because she felt exposed. And then I told her something that finally broke through that polished confidence. I told her I had options, that I could walk away quietly and let things continue the way they were. Or I could stop protecting her world, stop filling in gaps, stop smoothing over risks. Stop being the silent safety net she'd never even acknowledged. And that's when I saw it, real fear flicker across her face. Not fear of losing me, not fear of hurting me, but fear of losing control, fear of her image cracking, fear of consequences she'd never believed she'd have to face. And in that moment it became painfully clear that what she loved most wasn't our marriage or even our life together. It was the version of herself the world applauded. And for the first time in decades, sitting there in that familiar room with the walls that had witnessed our entire adult lives, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt in control, not because I was threatening her, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I finally understood my own worth, and she could see that I did. And once a person realizes you're no longer afraid to walk away, the power dynamic shifts in a way that can never be undone.
What happened next didn't explode into headlines or gossip the way people imagine downfall does. It unfolded quietly, professionally, behind closed doors where real power actually lives. In conference rooms with long tables and neutral faces and words chosen carefully. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because chaos gives people excuses, and I was done giving anyone excuses. It started with meetings, small at first, routine on the surface, requests for clarification. Follow-up questions about compliance decisions that had been rubber-stamped for years without much thought. Then came the audits, internal at first, then broader, not aggressive, not accusatory, just thorough. And the thing about thorough work is that it doesn't need drama to expose truth. It just lays it out piece by piece until denial becomes impossible. Mark stood by me through all of it, not loudly, not like a hero making speeches, but steadily. The way a professional does when they know who actually keeps the wheels turning. And when I spoke in those rooms, I didn't raise my voice or point fingers. I explained processes, documented decisions, timelines, dependencies, and I answered questions honestly, even when the answers were uncomfortable, especially when they were uncomfortable. And the board listened, really listened, because they weren't hearing opinions or personal grievances. They were hearing facts laid out by the man who had been quietly protecting the company from itself for years. And Linda's position began to wobble, not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly, the way trust erodes when people realize they've been relying on assumptions instead of substance. It wasn't because of me, no matter how easy it would have been for her to tell herself that. It was because of her choices, because she had cut corners believing someone else would catch them. Because she had leaned on systems she didn't respect, because she had mistaken silence for weakness and loyalty for stupidity. And I didn't lie about anything. I didn't exaggerate a single risk or inflate my role. I simply stopped covering, stopped smoothing things over behind the scenes, stopped fixing problems before they reached the surface. And once I stepped back, the truth did the rest on its own. Questions multiplied, confidence wavered, conversations changed tone. And I watched as her reputation began to crack, not shatter, not implode in one spectacular moment, but crack slowly, visibly, enough that everyone in those rooms could finally see what was underneath the polished image they'd applauded for so long. And sitting there, watching it happen, I didn't feel joy or satisfaction the way I thought I might. I felt calm, grounded, like a man finally standing on solid ground after years of shifting beneath someone else's shadow. Because this wasn't revenge fueled by anger, it was accountability fueled by truth. And once truth enters a boardroom, mate, there's no laughing it away.
At home, the woman I had lived with for decades slowly turned into someone I barely recognized. And the change didn't happen all at once. It came in waves, first anger, sharp and explosive, like she could scare the situation back into place by sheer force. She accused me of betraying her, of embarrassing her, of turning people against her, as if the truth itself had taken sides. And I watched her pace the house with restless energy, slamming drawers, muttering under her breath, her confidence cracking in ways I had never seen before, because for the first time in her life the world wasn't responding to her the way she expected. Then the anger gave way to defensiveness, long explanations that blamed everyone else. The board, Mark, corporate politics, timing, bad luck, anything but herself. And she talked and talked as if she could drown out reality with words, as if she could convince me that none of this was really happening. But I wasn't arguing anymore. I wasn't trying to correct her or defend myself. I was simply listening. And that seemed to unsettle her more than shouting ever could. And when that didn't work, when she realized I wasn't backing down or filling the silence with reassurance, something else crept in, desperation, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. She started watching me closely, asking where I was going, what I was thinking, trying to read my face the way she never had before. And one night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table where we'd shared countless ordinary meals, she finally tried to apologize, but the words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth, like lines practiced in advance, carefully chosen to minimize damage rather than heal it. She said she hadn't meant it, that she was under pressure, that she'd been joking, that she didn't realize how much it hurt me, and maybe part of her even believed that. But apologies don't land when they come after exposure instead of reflection, and listening to her, I realized something painful but clarifying. You can't unmock years of disrespect with one sorry. You can't erase a pattern of belittling behavior by suddenly pretending it was all a misunderstanding. And I told her calmly, without anger or spite, that I was done, not done in a dramatic way, not storming out or making threats, just done in the quiet, final sense of a man who has reached the end of his patience. I told her I deserved better, not more money, not more praise, but basic respect, and that I always had, even when I didn't demand it. And she looked at me then like she was truly seeing me for the first time, not as an accessory, not as a safety net, but as a man who no longer needed her approval to know his worth. And in that moment, the mask she'd worn for so long finally fell away, leaving behind someone unsure of who she was without admiration to prop her up. And as heavy as that realization was, it also felt like release, because once the mask is gone, there's no pretending left. And I walked away from that conversation knowing there was no version of our old life waiting to be salvaged, only a new one I would have to build on my own terms. Walking away at 56 wasn't easy, not the way people imagine, as some grand liberation or instant catharsis. It was slow, like lifting a weight that's been pressing on you for decades, each step tentative, every choice measured, but it was also strangely freeing, because for the first time in years I was living for me and not for someone else's perception of who I should be. The mornings felt different, waking up without the familiar tension coiled in the air, no silent judgment, no lingering resentment staring back at me from across the kitchen table, just quiet light filtering through the blinds. And I realized that peace could live in those small, almost invisible moments, the kind you never appreciate when your life has been a constant performance. I threw myself into work that mattered, work that didn't need applause or approval, the kind of work where competence and integrity actually counted, and it felt good to contribute without fear of ridicule, to solve problems that made a difference without someone constantly undercutting me or laughing behind my back. And as I rebuilt myself professionally, I started noticing people who respected me, not superficially or because they owed me something, but genuinely, colleagues who listened, who sought my advice, who valued my experience. And it was a revelation, because I had spent so long underestimating the importance of being truly seen, being acknowledged not for grand gestures, but for consistent effort. And slowly, over months, that recognition began to seep into other parts of my life. I allowed myself to take pride in small victories, to enjoy quiet dinners without tension, to travel for work and return feeling satisfied rather than drained. I didn't get rich, at least not in the way the world measures it, with numbers in a bank account or flashy titles, but I got something far more substantial. Something that had been denied to me for years, without me even realizing it. Self-worth, the kind that doesn't depend on someone else's approval, that doesn't shrink in the shadow of someone else's success. And with it came confidence, not loud or arrogant, but steady, the kind that carries you through challenges, because you know your value even when no one is applauding. I learned to enjoy solitude without feeling lonely, to savor routines that grounded me rather than constrained me, to embrace friendships that weren't transactional, but genuinely reciprocal. And with each passing day, I rebuilt pieces of myself I had long forgotten, the man who knew his limits, who respected his boundaries, who refused to be minimized any longer. And that rebuilding wasn't linear. It wasn't without moments of doubt or grief for what had been lost, for the years spent under the weight of mockery and dismissal. But even the grief became a tool, a way to remind myself what I deserved, to sharpen my vision for the life I was now choosing to lead. And as I stood at 56, with my own pace, my own space, my own respect restored, I realized that freedom isn't about starting over with nothing. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were never truly allowed to exist. It's about understanding that the wealth of self-worth surpasses the fleeting riches of recognition from those who never valued you. And in that quiet reclamation, I finally felt whole again, not because anyone had acknowledged it, not because anyone had praised it, but because I had finally seen it in myself. And that peace, that hard-earned dignity, was worth far more than any salary, title, or forced compliment could ever be. If there's one thing I want anyone reading this to really take to heart, it's this. Never ever measure a person by their paycheck, by the size of their house, the car they drive, or the titles they put on their business cards, because those things tell you nothing about the person underneath, nothing about the years they've spent quietly building, protecting, and sustaining things that matter far more than what's visible on the surface. And never, under any circumstances, mock someone who stays quiet, because silence isn't always compliance, silence isn't always submission, silence can be patience. Awareness and intelligence all wrapped up in one, and I learned that the hard way, the kind of way that leaves scars and lessons in equal measure, because for decades I had been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed by the very people who should have seen me clearly, and I allowed it, not because I was weak, but because I had faith, a misguided faith, that respect was something that would be given freely, that effort and loyalty would eventually be recognized, that love would be enough to shield me from mockery, and I was wrong, painfully wrong, and I paid the price with years of being minimized, being the punchline, being invisible in my own marriage. But silence, mate, silence gave me the power I never realized I had, because it allowed me to observe, to understand patterns, to gather truth, to prepare, and in that quiet preparation, in that patient attention to detail, I built leverage not to destroy, not to humiliate, but to reveal. To expose reality in a way that no joke or insult ever could. And when the time came, the moment I finally confronted the person who had belittled me, and then allowed the systems I had quietly maintained to speak for themselves in the boardroom, I realized that my years of quiet work, of invisible effort, of patience, had created a force more powerful than anger, more powerful than dramatic revenge, because it was rooted in truth, in integrity, in undeniable value. And what I want people to understand is that those who underestimate you because you don't shout, because you don't demand attention, because you quietly do what needs to be done, they are making the biggest mistake of all, because a man who listens, who observes, who learns and waits, is the man who can change everything quietly and completely. And it's not just about revenge or proving someone wrong, it's about reclaiming your life, your worth, and your dignity, about standing up in your own time, on your own terms, and letting truth finally speak louder than mockery ever could. So the moral is simple but crucial. Never measure a person by their paycheck, never dismiss quiet strength, and never mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes, mate, silence is simply a man who has been listening, learning, and waiting. And when the moment is right, he will show you just how powerful that quiet strength can be.